I got ADHD, baby. I set my goals, not your expectations, baby. I need my tools and a brain vacation, baby. Neurodivergent flow, no limitation, baby.
Today on our little IG Live series, I feel like I need a name for this program. I've been secretly calling it like an ADHD talk show, but we'll see what happens. I'm gonna start to brainstorm. But if anybody that's listening, if you have any idea of what I should call this series, let me know. But today's topic is all around ADHD and safety. And I want to do, for those that are watching and those that are going to be listening to the replay, I want to do a little bit of a trigger warning, just because we're going to get into things and items related to what happens when individuals are not managing their ADHD or don't even know that they have ADHD and end up in prison. So if that is a sensitive area for you, I want to make sure that you are aware that we're going to get into some topics related to the prison system and things that can lead up to that. So putting that little caveat out there for everybody that is listening. Dr. Lynn did a better job with the trigger warning explanation before you called
Oh, you did great. You
than
did
I
great.
did. So, it's late. I'm tired and you know what it is, but it is what it is. So here we are. So I'm going to have Dr. Lynn introduce herself, and then I'll just kind of talk a little bit about how we even ended up talking about this topic in the first place. Uh-oh.
That sounds
Okay.
wonderful. Oh, are we doing okay with the tech? Um, hi, I'm Dr. Lyne Piché. I'm a registered psychologist, and I've worked with people who have ADHD. I've worked with people who have ADHD who have sexual issues, and also people who are in the criminal justice system. And so Megan and I thought it would be fun to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the maybe the darker side of
Yeah.
having ADHD and some of the things that we have to keep in mind and try to negotiate within the ADHD community. Usually when I'm talking about ADHD and sex, and that's,
Mhm.
kind of a fun, light topic, and we can kind of get into a lot of really fun stuff. When we're talking about that impulsivity and how it can impact decision making or getting in trouble with police, it's a little bit more of a harder talk, but I
Mhm.
think it's so important for us to be talking about some of those things that are harder to talk about, but also might be helpful in prevention, in understanding how to think about certain decisions you might be making, or looking at where that might lead you or what could happen. And so both in regards to protecting ourselves and not being victimized, and also ensuring that we're not hurting or victimizing other people. So that's kind of our topic for today.
Yeah. And
Megan, can
I
you
re-
hear me okay? Yeah,
yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
perfect. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, so I reached out to Dr. Lynn just for that reason because it was really intriguing to me, like the numbers of individuals within the prison system, the criminal justice system that do have ADHD, either getting diagnosed once they're arrested or serving their time or have known that they have ADHD prior to that. And that's not like, and that's not even just thinking about the complications of all of that, but then also um, the complications are related to having ADHD and just getting trouble like within your school system or and the impact that it has on kids and the direction that they can end up walking on the path that they end up walking down because of the way that they're being treated, right? And so with they're not managing certain impulses or don't have access to the resources that they need, they end up on a path that could have been prevented.
I
Um,
love that you mentioning the school system and looking at how early some of these patterns and problems start, Megan. When you think about um, the reality of big emotions, right? Big,
mhm,
strong emotions and impulsivity. Those two things put together really is what we're talking about. How
mhm,
impulsivity and big emotions can create this beautiful hyper focus where you launch a business or you have a branding idea or you have something that you're doing, and you're able to provide a lot of really good positive things to our communities. But that impulsivity and the strong emotions as well can also lead to problems at school, getting in trouble, more detentions, more suspensions, just having a hard time fitting in. And one of the things we know about ADHD youth is that it can be really hard for them to identify the social skill deficits that
Mhm.
they're having. So you can maybe not realize how much you are negatively impacting somebody or poking at somebody. Um, I talk a lot about stimming on people. You
Mhm.
know, if you're kind of bored and you're sitting in school, you're sitting in a space and your brain is bored and you're like, oh, I need some dopamine. So I'm going to poke, 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 or I'm going to do something, I'm going to say something, and I'm going to create some drama, I'm going to create some stuff. And now my brain is interested again.
Mhm.
And you can see how that can very easily lead to some negative decision making and how all of that connects to getting in more trouble.
Right, and some negative labels also. And so
Yes,
if the
yes.
adults around you don't fully understand what's happening, and then labels are placed on you because of that.
It's interesting the labels as people are understanding ADHD and knowing it, and teachers and education systems. As you know, I'm in Canada, and so sometimes there are differences, I think, in between our systems. But more and more, what I would say in North America is because educators are much more aware of ADHD and aware, I think, of more of the symptoms. I'm really hopeful that the younger generation is going to have an easier time with some of this than we did, where, there were those negative labels that were being placed on you by your classmates and also by sometimes the teachers or the administrators of a certain school or within a certain system.
I'm hoping so. I'm going to hold on to your word of hopeful as well, because sometimes it is definitely hard to see that when there's still especially here in the States, there's still a lack of understanding around ADHD. There's a better understanding than from when we were small, for sure, but there's still inconsistent, and understanding may not be the right word. There's an inconsistent opinion maybe about
Sure.
ADHD and its existence or how it should be treated. And what are the best methods and navigating classrooms when you have children with difference. And so there's still a lot of, depending on where you're at in the States,
Yes.
it can vary for sure, and what services are provided and what services aren't provided. And having inclusive education, there's still a lot of discussion around what that looks like, for sure. But what we do know is that the there's a consequence when we are constantly putting negative labels on our students and using negative communication as they're growing and their brains are developing, and especially if they have ADHD. And so we want to make sure, as the adults in the lives of the children and youth around us, that we're acknowledging that they still have their own growth to do, emotional development to do, and we need to provide resources and not shame, um, with what they're dealing with.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So when we're thinking about people that get in trouble with the prison system, whether they're detained or, they've been convicted and incarcerated, the amount of people who have ADHD, some research is like it's a five-fold increase, some other research is it's a tenfold increase. So I like to say, somewhere between 5 and 10 times more people with ADHD in prisons than you would have in what you would expect in a regular community. And so ADHD in prison has been a problem for a long, long time. But adult ADHD, more to the point that you're talking about, is hasn't been taken, I think, as seriously in regards to how do we
Mhm.
address it? What does that look like in regards to the impulsivity and the big emotions? And then how do we have interventions that are actually helpful?
Mhm.
Um, the city, I really want to pull in this idea of hope. You know, the city of London, I think last year, 2003, started screening. So at first arrest, if police are arresting somebody, at first arrest, they're now screening for ADHD. So those are the police
Oh,
officers are screening. I know, isn't that great? Right? It's
that is
beautiful.
great. I feel like I need to look
It's
that up.
so great.
That is
Yeah.
great.
As far as I know, they're the first and the only ones that are doing this. And so, this movement of really recognizing what the research has said for a long time, which is ADHD is overrepresented in the prison system. And so, given that, now how are we going to manage that and do something different with that information rather than just ignore it or kind of go, well, yes, you have ADHD, but you should still not be impulsive. You should still not have these really big emotions. Um, so it's very, very cool that London is doing this. And I'm again really hopeful that that's something that the other police detachments are going to start and we can bring this to North America. If you're screening for ADHD at the very front end,
Mm-hmm.
now you've got something to work with.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the information that we have, I've got somebody going, yay, London, yay, London. We know that when you take somebody who is impulsive and has really big emotions and you put them in these very negative environments, there is going to be more problems, more misconduct, more issues. Sometimes, I think about ADHD and the criminal justice world, and I go, we take people who already are having a hard time, we make that even harder. We squeeze it and we go, hey, can you still manage your impulsivity?
Right.
And of course, many people with ADHD are going to fail that particular test. Certainly, if it hasn't been diagnosed or if it was diagnosed as children, but nobody's really considering that, both in how we're teaching
Mm-hmm.
new skills and also how what we're expecting from people within these environments.
Yeah, and it's
And
not,
this is where we see, yeah, go for it.
yeah, and it's not to excuse behavior, right? Like
No,
it's not an
absolutely not.
excuse, but it is an explanation for certain behaviors, right? And so it's addressing the root challenges that people may be experiencing, and the goal is to provide services, provide treatment options, so that they're not repeating the same destructive behavior that they may have been experiencing before. But that's really good to
Absolutely.
hear about London. I feel like I
Yes.
definitely am going to look that up. I'm glad that somebody is taking ADHD seriously and recognizing the patterns that we all see happen on a regular basis.
Well, and yeah, I want to really pick up on your point of none of this is about excuses. Of course not. There's a lot of people who have ADHD that are not breaking rules and are not getting into like serious trouble.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have, often if you have this combination of actively using drugs over, intoxication, and
Mm-hmm.
you have had adverse childhood events, which we know people with ADHD tend to have, and neurodivergent people as a group
Mm-hmm.
tend to have had more negative experiences growing up. And you put all that together, and it's a bit of a powder keg,
Right.
you know? So those are some of the things that I think it's important to start thinking about. And as we're talking in the ADHD community and as we are figuring out how do we want to support each other, do we also have to have those hard conversations? If you're struggling with addictions, that's
Mm-hmm.
particularly dangerous if you're impulsive and you have big emotions and now you're intoxicated. Are you going to be making a safe choice for yourself and for others? And
Right.
how do we have those conversations? Um, when we're thinking about, London and this idea of the first arrest, there was some information, I think Attitude had it very recently around false confessions and this idea that ADHDers tend to be more falsely accused and how can we help the police authorities do more for allowing the interview process to happen, allowing people to fidget, not misinterpreting somebody is being detained for something and we're asking them questions
Hmm.
and you're fidgeting or you're not making eye contact if you're more on the aspie side of
Right.
things and you're uncomfortable, and are you just going to blurt out a confession kind of impulsively so that you don't get into trouble?
Hmm.
Or sorry, so you can just leave the room. You end up in more trouble, but so that you can leave the room. And it's interesting, there was some kind of newer stuff coming out very recently that talks about how ADHDers tend to make false confessions, yes, but it also may be about protecting somebody else, that loyalty, not wanting somebody else to get in trouble, and that impulsive, I'll just say I did it without really thinking about the consequences
Yeah.
over time, right?
Yeah.
And kind of another form of victimization.
Yeah. And that's also, when you start also thinking about the executive functions around planning and prioritization too, like, and being able to organize their thoughts. So they're being bombarded with questions, and then being able to organize their thoughts enough, and combining that with planning and prioritization as it relates to themselves or a colleague or a friend or something else like that. Like that's also going to be a challenge to be able to articulate what it is that you actually want to articulate. And if you're not given that opportunity to process the information first, you can say anything. um, and, this is the people pleasing part of ADHD as well. And so it's like, well, let me just give them the answer that they want and not, yeah, and exactly what you said, like not think about the consequences as it relates to the rest of my life or the people around me.
Absolutely. So that in itself, I think when we're talking about ADHD and safety in the criminal justice system, it's that safety of right from the get-go, how do you ensure that you're engaging in a way that you have the time to be thoughtful, that you have the time to calm down and think about what's happening right now? Do I need extra resources? Do I need to have somebody there with me, a support
Mm-hmm.
person who can just make sure that I'm taking the time to think through the decisions that are happening right now? These are
Mm-hmm.
big, pivotal life events,
Yeah.
and it can be hard to manage those pivotal life events, particularly, as you say, if the executive functioning isn't great,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't think through some of the consequences. So I always think that that particular body of research around ADHD and false confessions is really fascinating. And we don't have nowhere near enough research or information about it, but
Right.
certainly there's some interesting ideas floating around.
And it just made me think about too, like, I work with women that have ADHD, and many women are getting diagnosed later in life. And so the number, and I have not looked at the research around this at all. And I don't know if you can speak to this. If you can't, don't feel like you need to. But just thinking about the number of women that are engaged in the criminal justice system and in the prison system and are finding out that they have ADHD later in life. Like if they're older in the prison system and now they're experiencing premenopause or menopause, and their behavior is drastically shifted, and like who's paying attention to that, like are they able to get access to resources, are they getting diagnosed later, and just thinking about the impact that that could have. Like you have already had challenges with your ADHD, you end up with in jail, in prison, or in trouble, right? And then now you're there for a little while, now you're experiencing premenopause, and now you're menopausal and still not.
That
And anybody that's a aging woman knows that the ADHD kind of goes haywire if you're not, because your hormones are shifting. And so, and you could have been the model prisoner in the system, and then you hit menopause or premenopause, and now you're not. Um, and then the impact that could have also.
Those are
That's
fantastic questions. I can't speak to kind of women's corrections, partly because it's not much of my background, but also because we barely have the research for men, and it's such a big problem on that side. I don't
yeah.
know of anything that has information about women, but you have piqued my interest in seeing if I can add that particular piece of information, because that would be fascinating. We have wonderful researchers or students out there. I think this is a really, really important space to start thinking about that. Um, right now, even the people that we know had childhood ADHD or have ADHD, the they're overrepresented, and the system has struggled to how do you manage this and what does this
Mhm.
look like?
Mhm.
um, we're really still in that space of identifying it as a problem and making sure that people are aware of this. I think just this importance of, I like your idea of protecting each other, right? How do
Mhm.
we talk about this? How do we talk to people in the community so that they know, hey, this may be something that could happen to you. So
Mhm.
what is happening in your decision making that might bring you down that road?
Yeah.
Right? When you're running around looking for stim, are you engaging in safe stim? Is this a
Mhm.
safe, positive hyper focus? Is this a hyper focus that could get you in trouble, and how? And
Mhm.
kind of really mapping some of that stuff out.
Yeah, and if you're not able to do that, that level of self-awareness, or that self-awareness will work for yourself, like ensuring that you have people around you that you trust and you feel safe with, that will be able to have these conversations with you
So
also.
important. So important. We think about the victimization piece, I was saying earlier that ADHDers and people who are neurodivergent are more likely to be victims as well. And one of the pieces that I have in the workbook, the ADHD and sex workbook, is a chapter on neurodivergent safety. And I really felt like I couldn't talk about ADHD and sex without talking about this potential and this reality that there is more reported victimization in our community. And so, again, how do we start talking about that in a
Mhm.
way that says, hey, you're chasing this, and how could you get hurt in this?
Mhm.
We don't know why ADHDers are more likely to be victimized, but I think many of your viewers can think of situations or times when maybe they've made an impulsive decision, maybe they've felt a very strong emotion and said something or did something or whatever,
Yeah.
was in a situation where you look back and you're like, ooh, that could have gone sideways.
Yeah.
And again, it's never your fault. If you've been victimized, that's not your fault. That's not what we're saying. But it's about
Yeah.
prevention. And I don't know about you, Megan, but a lot of the prevention I've heard over the years is just be more careful,
Yeah.
right? So if something happens to you, right, just don't run out in front of that car. Just be more careful. Just think about it. Just. These very neurotypical ways of thinking about safety.
Yeah, just and should and coulds and woulds, like all of those words.
Yes. Yeah. Right? And you're like, but this isn't helpful. It's also not neurodivergent friendly at all. And so, what would neurodivergent friendly prevention strategies look like? What does the ADHD community need to create something that better reflects our needs, better reflects what is actually going to be helpful more than you should have, you could have?
Mhm.
Just notice, right? I always laugh. I'm like, well, if people could just notice, that the diagnosis wouldn't be there.
Right.
Right?
And for those that are listening that do not have ADHD and are using that language, just think about, as soon as you say just, it's
Mm.
probably incorrect. Like, you could probably go if you're starting with the word just recognize that that's a red flag, and there's another way that you could communicate whatever it is that you're trying to communicate.
So, what are some of the ways? I don't know if people in the chat have some ideas. I'm happy to talk about some of the ways that, I've kind of thought through, how do we do this in a way that is more neurodivergent friendly? How do we start paying attention to trends in our relationships, for example, or in our choices
Mhm.
that could kind of go sideways? Um, Megan, do you have thoughts or ways that just
Yeah,
quickly come to
I mean,
mind?
the first thing that came to mind is really getting rid of some of the stigma that comes along with ADHD and being able to have just honest conversations with the people in your circle around ADHD and how it impacts you and them, and creating those psychologically safe spaces, right? Like that's the first thing that popped in my mind, because if we're not able to talk about it honestly, then it's going to be really difficult for to be able to intervene or to provide some other feedback or options or resources, right? And so there's
Yes.
still a lot of stigma around ADHD, and it still makes a lot of people uncomfortable. I mean, and in the context of work, because that's usually when I'm working in the context of work, like even people don't want to talk about it within their workplace to be able to get access to services that they have the right to get to have. And it's because of the bias and the stigma that comes along with it that they don't want to have to deal with afterwards. So they're choosing to not access the resources that is available to them because of the potential bias and outcomes that could happen as a result of that. And so again, so the first thing that comes to my mind is just creating safe and safety in ADHD is just being okay that ADHD exists
Yeah.
and that and that it's a neurological difference and that's okay. And some creating some neutrality around the language that we use when we're describing how individuals function in the world and not expecting everybody to fit into one single box. That was the
Yes.
first thing that came to mind for me.
I love it. I love it. So really what I'm hearing you say is if somebody says to you, what is the dopamine that you're chasing right now? What is the stim that you're chasing right now? And you can openly and honestly say what that stim is. Then
Mm-hmm.
now there's space for people to then in your community say, well, you know, chasing this particular stim could really get you into trouble.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, if you're chasing the stim of driving fast, or you're chasing the stim of, I don't know, adding some grapes to your self checkout at the end of the day, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is how is that stim problematic? And more importantly, is there kind of a better stim that you might want to go after that would be just as fun for your brain, but much safer for you?
Mm-hmm.
So, openly asking ourselves, what stim am I looking for right now? And then being willing to tell somebody else. And you're
Yeah, and
right,
that
that's often where it falls. Yeah, go for
yeah,
it.
and and thinking, it's one thing of being diagnosed as an adult, but if you were diagnosed as a youth, as a child, and your brain is underdeveloped anyway, right? And so you're chasing impulsivity is just your bread and butter, right? As
Yes.
as a young adult, in general, and thinking about how many conversations are not happening like with their peers, and do they even know that it's a stim that they're even chasing? Do they know that they're looking for that dopamine rush? Are we even teaching that language, for people to be used? Like, do they have the vocabulary to even explain what a STEM is, you know what I mean? And
Yes.
so, I mean, I see that with adults too. We don't know that we're chasing dopamine because we're not understanding the relationship between dopamine and ADHD, or just how our brains work in general, because we kind of treat the brain like it's not a part of our body. It's a very real weird phenomenon, like that controls like practically everything that we do, right? And so, um, like it's not the thing that you can just take out and put on the shelf and separate your identity from. Like it's who you are.
It's a part of you.
Um, it's a part
So
of
when we
you.
think, yeah,
Yeah, and so just being able
yeah,
to be clear around the language that we're even using so that you can have these conversations with people, because we need to be able to have these conversations. Like, you are dopamine chasing and you are stimming, and somebody had made a comment too, like relationships are stim too, and it's true.
oh
Like, you end up
yes,
in
yeah,
relationships for a lot longer, than you
yeah.
may want to, because of that.
Okay, I want to come to that comment because it's really brilliant. It's awesome. But before we jump to that, one of the things as you were talking about youth and STEM and growing up, when your STEM is sports, for example, and you're chasing that dopamine as a young adult, and you're playing a lot of sports, that's a great example of like a more positive outcome
Mm-hmm.
that's related to more positive outcomes versus if a young adult, you're chasing that stim of shoplifting or conflict or
Right.
physical fights, right? These things that are less likely to work really well for you long term and more likely to get you into trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so beautiful. Relationships are a STEM too. Yes. So if we're talking about neurodivergent safety and we're talking about the criminal justice system and ADHD, one of the things is that people who are perpetrating domestic violence, often ADHD will be part of that picture in some way, shape, or form. And when you think again about impulsivity, rejection sensitivity, big emotions, it makes a lot of sense, at least for me, when I think about the concepts and um, the the problems that can happen within
Mm-hmm.
relationships, and that stimming where you can have these conflicts that get out of control. You can have somebody that's running with power and control and wanting to feel like they are expressing ownership. They are, jealous. All these things that happen which then can lead again to problems and to hurting other people.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're in a relationship and part of your stim is somebody who isn't doing well, somebody who isn't making good choices, or somebody who's scaring you for reasons, that can kind of hook you in a very kind of weird way where you
Mm-hmm.
know that this is not good for you, yet somehow you're not able to very easily exit.
Mm-hmm.
It's another great example where not keeping that secret and talking to that community and the people around you about what's happening can literally save your life.
Yeah.
So that you have that support and that accountability of going, okay, there might be other ways for you to be safer in the
Mm-hmm.
community, in your relationships.
Yeah, and especially in relationships, it can when there isn't a lot of knowledge or conversations around ADHD or understanding around it, like the communication challenges that can happen. And, we've had conversations offline around like ADHD and sex, right? And the complications that can come along with that. But if we're not, if we're undiagnosed or diagnosed and not addressing the ADHD, and then there's just more conflict within the relationship, um, that can cause a lot of challenges and create a very unsafe environment, both emotionally and sometimes physically. So
Yes.
it's very important. I think it's extremely important to just, I don't know if I can say this enough, like diagnose, talk about it, research about it, get the support that you need, so that we can maintain some level of safety in all of our environments, because we don't really talk about the emotional impact or like the emotional abuse that can happen either in relationships or honestly even in work.
Yes.
Also, because sometimes like work environments can feel very abusive in a lot of ways. And there is generally a lack of understanding around people in general within the workplace, or a lack of
So
basic understanding of human development, or in general within work environments. But when you throw ADHD in it, you're a neurodiverse individual working in a space that is very neurotypical and has very neurotypical expectations. And now you're burnt out, and it can feel very emotionally abusive. Um,
and it
and
can be very emotionally abusive.
mhm,
Of we're right back to this, just do this or just do that, or just function in this certain way.
mhm,
um we were talking about relationships and ways that things can go sideways. I really want to reiterate this idea that none of these things are excuses. It doesn't mean that it's not your fault both ways. It doesn't mean that it's your fault that you've been victimized. It also doesn't mean that it's not your fault if you have victimized. But
mhm,
understanding some of these dynamics can really help um, appropriate interventions and appropriate things to happen that will then be better for everybody in our community.
mhm,
Um, my favorite like relationship stimming example is, you're going down the road and you're driving and you're with a partner and, your brain's kind of bored and you go, yeah, you're looking pretty old. Right? Poke. And then where does that go from there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if that, if your partner now feels rejected and hurt and like they failed and the conflict escalates, and the more that we can talk about when I'm in a relationship, these are the things that I do when I'm bored. When I'm
Mm-hmm.
in a relationship, when I'm at work, these are the things that I do when I'm bored. And
Mm-hmm.
are those things contributing to some of the problems that I'm then having with my coworkers or my partnerships? And how can I better address my brain being bored? Right? What could I
Right.
do instead that would probably be better for everybody involved?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. How do you see that boredom happening at work, Megan, and how that maybe relates to the safety question?
Um, in so many ways. So, I mean, the boredom for sure, especially if you're doing work that just is not interesting to you at all, or there's a portion of your job that is really interesting, but then maybe the administrative part of your position is taxing some weaker executive functions and you're just having a really hard time, right? Or and then you end up in a conversation with your direct manager, you end up on a PIP and a performance improvement plan because of that, right? And so now you receive this email saying like we need to talk, right? Like the we need to talk email that you get in like personal relationships, but also at work, and how that can trigger within this educational system too. Like if you end up on a probationary period, like in undergrad or grad school, right? You get this email and this alert that you're now in trouble, and now your emotions can potentially be all over the place. And the question is, how do you react in those particular situations? Are you taking a moment to breathe, or are you immediately responding with, oh, and just all of the things, all the things that are probably true, but should they be written via email, right? And so, and then it can create job insecurity, right? And so then now you're in a position where you could potentially lose your job, or you lost your job and now you can't pay your bills. And now what are you going to do? What decisions are you going to be making after that when you realize that you have bills to pay? And are you making good decisions? Or are you making impulsive decisions?
So, in these hot spots, these times in our lives where it really matters, what we
Mm-hmm.
say, what we do, how we respond to a certain event really, really matters. How do we get better in those moments to recognize the hot spot? The hot
Mm-hmm.
spot when you have to go and do a please explain at work, or the hot spot when the police are asking you questions about something that happened yesterday, or that hot spot of the relationship that's not feeling safe. And where do you go with those things?
Mm-hmm.
If we could identify them better, and have a bit of a game plan of
Mm-hmm.
when I'm in these hot spots, this is what I'm going to do. I think it would feel a little safer. There would be a little less anxiety because you would know what you want your protocol to be at that point, right? And that
Mm-hmm.
can very, very
Yeah,
much
I was.
easily be there's somebody that I call that I trust, and they are the person that's going to help guide me through this hot spot.
Mm-hmm. And I
Sorry,
always
Megan,
tell
what were you
people,
going to say?
I was going to say, I always tell all of my clients that it's so important to study yourself.
Ah,
Pay attention
yes.
to your triggers, pay attention to your behaviors, pay attention to your best time of day, pay attention to like where you're the most functional and clear headed. Pay attention to what types of situations can trigger you and take you out of the executive function state, right? And so and more into the fight or flight state. So what are those things? Are you crystal clear on those situations? And then do you have a game plan when they come up?
So, as I'm listening to you talk, I'm really hearing about this idea of education.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a decent foundational of education and you can think through these questions that you've just asked, you're going to be in a better, safer place than if you haven't been taught how to ask those questions, how to self reflect, how
Mhm.
to manage your ADHD, what it all means.
Mhm.
One of the things that we're missing, if we bring this back to the criminal justice system, we're really missing programming specific to ADHD and executive functioning.
Mhm.
And so if we're not teaching those skills, and if we look at high school, right, we're not specifically teaching classes on this is how you manage executive function. This is how you manage if you're neurodivergent. If anybody's out there that goes to a high school where that's being taught, please let me know. Love to hear about it. Are those fundamental kind of basic pieces of our education required in some of these bigger organizations as a really important part of our prevention?
Mhm. I mean, they're not. Um,
They're not required or they're not available.
I mean, both. They're not available or they're not required. And like, I feel like a lot of this information has to happen within the home. I mean, at this point, I mean, here in the States, we're arguing over everything,
Yeah.
as it relates to education, right? And so just then adding to the topic of conversation and the table of things that we're trying to decide are important, um, including teaching people around their own executive functions. I mean, that's not going to happen
I, I'm
anytime
here. I'm
soon.
here.
I mean,
I'm
I'm
hearing
trying
you
to
to say
hold on
there's
to
a
your
hope. Yeah,
hopeful.
no,
I'm trying to hold on to your hope. I really am. Um, and maybe
this
it's
is
just too
this
late
is
in
the
the
Canadian
evening.
viewpoint. Oh yeah, we can figure this out. Maybe
I'm
it's like, no, there's
like,
no
no,
friggin'
this
way.
is so not happening. Not in my generation, I feel like. But I mean, I do have hope for the next generation that it has a higher level of awareness around ADHD in general. And I am hoping that they are able to do something differently than our generation and like the generations prior for sure. Is every year, I mean, every generation it gets a little bit better. And so,
Yes.
maybe by the time my great grandson is in school,
There
then the
might be some
system
sort of
there,
class.
there
Yep.
might be some sort of class.
We do driving lessons. We do, like, there's driving schools. And I think my concern about having it come from the family within the household, which is, I mean, it's a great suggestion, but because this is often a genetic disorder, we
Mm-hmm.
have the parents who are struggling, the grandparents who are struggling, then the kids are struggling, and then saying on top of doing lunches and making sure that everybody's got what they need and driving everybody to and fro and managing your own career, now we want you teaching about neurodivergence in the family. Yes, do I tell people to do that a lot? Absolutely. I think it's super
Mm-hmm.
important. But at the end of the day, realistically, it would be, I think, more efficient if there was a thing, a place, don't even know where, love to get people's idea about this, of where we can teach neurodivergent safety from a very broad lens of what are the ways to live a neurodivergent lifestyle that is safe for you, safe for the community, good for how you want to get through your life? What are some of these questions that you need to ask yourself? And how do we teach that from a very objective way, in the same way that we teach you how to learn how to drive,
Yeah,
right?
and and I think back, like let me retract some of my statements. So I do think that some of this is taught, but not in using this explicit language. And so when thinking about the reality is like kids that have underdeveloped brains, like the brain isn't finished developing for a really long time. And so they are teaching like safety within the school system for kids, but it's just not in using that same particular language. So they're not saying it and teaching it in the context of neurodivergence. It's just in the context of like you're a kid, you need to be safe, right? And so there's and so there isn't that connection necessarily to this is how our where our brain is and like
Yeah.
growth and the development of I don't I I don't think that there's that direct connection. Like it would obviously make a little bit more sense to do that in high school and um,
Mhm.
college if that's what you are choosing to do. But drawing that connection to neurodivergence and brain development and impulsivity and like really talking explicitly around the executive functions is not happening from my experience, and I could be wrong. So anybody that's listening to this, if you feel like this is actually happening somewhere, please enlighten me.
Yes.
um,
We
for
have, yeah.
sure, but I
We
think there's
have,
just different,
yeah.
if you use different languages used.
It's not as concrete and explicit. I agree with you on that. And we have,
Mhm.
if a kid is neuro divergent or has special needs in school, we have, a specific plan that gets created for that child, and then they'll
Right.
have different workers that work with them. But we don't really seem to have like a more cohesive sort of program that would touch on a lot of these things. Um, One of the suggestions I have in the ADHD and sex workbook in that chapter on neurodivergent safety is about writing things down. So,
Mhm.
Megan, you've talked a lot about patterns, right? If you can see the pattern and have that self insight, you can kind of, but generally, we don't see the pattern. We will see
Mhm.
an event, but we don't see the pattern. And
Mhm.
so if you can start writing down those events, then when you go back and look at it, you will see more of a pattern. And I think that's a nice neurodivergent friendly way
Yeah.
of creating a little bit more safety, right? Every time I go out on Friday night, this is kind of what happens. And
Yeah.
then looking back at that and going, okay, are there things here that could hurt me, could hurt others? Are people hurting me? And what does that look like when I start looking at who that's happening with and how often? So I think we really need to like harness the power of the whiteboard here and try to
Yeah.
use that to our advantage.
I was gonna say there's actually an app for that. I feel like there's apps
Oh,
for
is
all of these
there?
things. Yeah, so there's this new I haven't personally used it to this extent, but I do know other people that do. It's called Audio Diary. So essentially
Okay, cool.
you can talk, it's a journal, and then you can just
Hmm.
talk through it, but then it will analyze what you needed to
Yeah,
analyze. And so um
really?
yeah, which is interesting. I mean, even if you use ChatGPT, if you had a written journal, right, like you could upload those pages and those documents and then say, like, have a prompt that's like, hey, I'm looking for patterns here. Like, these are the things that I could potentially be concerned about. I'm an adult with ADHD. I'm trying to protect myself. Can you notice some patterns that you like, point out some patterns that you may see in the context of this particular journal, these journal entries over the past couple of months? And so, but
Oof.
there is a journal that, so if you can't see the patterns, like, I mean, at this point
Yes.
AI does practically everything, and I think this is a good use of AI in the context of safety, like in making sure that you don't end up on a path that you don't want to be on.
That
Yeah,
is
especially if you're in
brilliant.
relationships or environments that feel really negative and you're journaling about that, and then you ask AI, like,
Mhm.
point out the patterns, and if it points out, like, hey, you're actually around a lot of negative people, and like negativity has X, Y, and Z impact on the brain, and this could be problematic in X, Y, and Z reasons, then it gives you something to think about.
Okay. Well, I don't know about everybody else, but my brain is absolutely blown right now. I have to check some of this out and see if it would actually work, but that would be wonderful. And it's such a great idea. Again, neurodivergent friendly. You can just tap it in, right? You can just say what you need to say. You can get that feedback. And this is what we're looking for, ways that can highlight things for you that are really easy to do, rather than saying again, you just should have, or how come you didn't see, da 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 da,
Hmm.
and really wanting to move away from that. So, Megan, what a great idea.
It's called Audio Diary. Yeah, Audio Diary.
Now, I have all the old person concerns about AI, but don't know anything about it. So, we'll figure, check that out.
That's so
I
funny.
think if anybody, yeah, I know, right? If anybody does check it out and it works well, please circle back and let us know.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
I'm gonna start using it a little bit more too. I mean, at this point, I just feel like your whole life is on AI, so whatever. At this point, I'm like, whatever. Everybody knows all my business. I just have given up on privacy. Um, but yeah, so the according to what the app says that it can do, and from other people's word of mouth experiences, that's what it can do, and so it can analyze some of the patterns that it sees. Um, but I like that because it is hard to see your own stuff, right? It's like you're emotionally wrapped into it, and like that's why it's also helpful to get an outside party. It's almost like cleaning, right? Like I can go to somebody else's house and organize everything because I'm not emotionally attached to all of the things. And so I don't have to then address my emotional dysregulation or the thoughts that I'm having and like all of the feelings that are coming up because of the different items within my space. I can just in somebody else's space. I can just go in there and be like, you don't need this, you don't need this, you don't need this. And make really quick rational decisions, right? But then in my own space, I'm like, oh, but I remember this from first grade. This is what my first, and this is just a real experience because I definitely just found a piece of paper that was from like my fifth grade teacher or something.
Oh my gosh.
I'm like, oh, I need this. Of course, I haven't thrown away this document. I don't even know why it's in this random place, but here it is. Um, and so, I have the strong like emotional attachment to those things. So cleaning and the organizing can be really difficult. But that's the same thing with trying to see the different patterns
Yes.
that are happening within your own life. You're trying to
And
see it when you're getting caught up in the individual pieces. That's just hard to step back to be able to see everything, if that makes sense.
absolutely. It makes so much sense. And, when you think about counseling and therapy, a really good therapist is also doing that. That's that
Hmm.
process, right? Of going and talking about your life and what's going on, and they're able to identify themes and patterns. And so always really encourage
Hmm.
people to use therapy if they can, and if they found somebody in their community, if it's affordable, so that you
Hmm.
have a little bit more of that feedback. And you
And
can
coaching
also,
too.
yeah. Mm-hmm. Sorry.
Yeah, coaching too. 'Cause we'll be
Yes,
coaching too, because we'll just be
of
able to call
course.
out
Yeah.
what we don't hear or don't see too. It's like you're talking about all these things, but what I didn't hear you say was.
Absolutely. Yes. As soon as you have that third party who can kind of look over things and have that conversation with, whether it's a coach or a mentor, or maybe it's a spiritual advisor, just somebody in your world that you trust that can help you with those patterns. And it's neat to think about all the different ways that people have found to get that feedback. We started today, Megan, and you were talking about secrecy, right? And one of the biggest things was not telling people what's going on. And
Hmm.
this, I think, is really that circle back to, yeah, if you actually tell people, this is the stem I'm chasing right now, and you can do that without that fear and that shame, and just have a grown-up conversation about it, all of a sudden these strategies to deal with it are generally fairly straightforward
Hmm.
once you have that conversation. So
Yeah,
it's an important part of the safety talk, I think.
I think so too. And let's end here. I feel like we could probably talk for like
Yeah.
another 3 hours, but um, to ensure that we are continuing to engage our audience. Let's stop here. I think that's a really good ending point, and I want to thank you for joining. But please share with us all of your information, where we can find your book and the name.
Happy to do that. Yes, ADHDsex.com is where you can find all the info. I've got a website. The new website will be up in a couple weeks now, so I'm really excited about that actually. And you'll find everything that you need on the website, literally just ADHDsex.com. And look forward to hearing about some of your thoughts. Um, my Instagram is ADHD Sex Workbook, so you're also welcome to send out if you have any comments or additional thoughts or whatever. We'd love to hear it.
Good, and she is awesome. So
Yeah,
please use her as a resource, okay? And
thank
then if you
you.
don't know me, if you don't know me by now in this conversation, I am Megan Brown Enya, and I provide group and one-on-one coaching for women with ADHD, and we tackle all the difficult topics within our conversations. But my goal is to ensure that you are thriving both in work and in life. And so, with that being said, I do have some things coming up, but you just honestly just go to my Instagram page, and you will find all the things. And I'm actually working on a little quiz for people to take to see if they're actually ready to access coaching. And so it's
Oh,
more of like a behavior readiness, a change readiness questionnaire,
got
because
it.
you will go through changes. But if you're not ready to change, then accessing coaching and therapy and other services can be really difficult. And so it will help you better understand where you're at and how you should move forward. So I'm working on that. And then in April, I'm going to be doing a goals workshop too. So there's a lot of really good things coming. Please ensure that you are following both of us, set an alert. I know specifically for my profile because I'll just be putting everything on there, or if you're accessing my email list, and make sure that you sign up for. You have an email list too, right?
I do,
Do you have an email?
yeah. So on the
Okay.
ADHD Sex ADHDsex.com, there is a sign up for an email list. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah,
And I know that we're inundated with emails. Like I get it.
I know.
It's
It drives me nuts. Drives me
it drives
absolutely nuts.
me nuts too, right? And so, and as I'm, like, it drives me nuts, but it's also necessary. There's a lot of good information, and so tip of the day is to create a filtering system that's like, if you're signing up for ADHD related newsletters and content information, create an ADHD folder, have the stuff filtered through there so that you can access it, right? And so, like, let's keep our email organized and not get annoyed by all of the newsletters that we receive on a regular basis. Just
I
organize them.
love it. I love
Um,
it. I love it. And thank you for the congratulations. I just saw your comment. Thank you so much for that. It was a lot of fun to write, so I'm pretty excited.
oh yeah,
Glad to share
it's
it.
awesome. Well,
Yeah.
again, thank you everybody for joining us this evening, and for those that are watching the replay, thanks for watching the replay. We will talk
Bye.
to you later. Have a good night.